So the video you guys just watched is talking about foster care, and I didn't know this until recently, and most of you probably don't know this, but May is Foster Care Awareness Month. And as you guys know, Jonathan and Alicia have been on this journey for a while now. You know, not just, the journey doesn't begin when you start fostering and have kids in your home either. The journey begins way before that, when you have to rearrange your whole house, you know, to go by all the guidelines that take place. You got to have everything basically perfect, you know, before you even get considered to have kids in your home. And so we thought today, being Mother's Day, would actually be a good day for them to share just a little bit about their journey of being foster parents. And just because, kind of as Rose hinted at earlier, there's a lot of kids that don't have functioning moms, and so, or dads for that matter. And so it takes people like Jonathan and Alicia to fill that gap a lot of the times. And so we're just going to let them share a few minutes about their journey in foster care.
And before we get started, I don't think, is there children's church? Yes. Children's church dismissal will be fantastic for this, especially. Thank you.
I never know what to expect. Well, thanks so much for letting us speak, and happy Mother's Day again. I don't want to be the latest one to say that to all the moms here, and just thank you so much for what you do. And what Lisa and I want to share is our prayer that this origin story that we're going to tell is going to be something that maybe sounds familiar to some of you. Maybe some of y'all have had the same thoughts, and maybe this can be start of the journey for you. And what I want to start with is where I began was a few years ago in our Sunday school class. Some of you may remember we did a book written by David Platt called Counterculture. And it was a book that was written by the pastor for Christians living in an anti-Christian world, in a world where there was things that were just against everything we stand for, things like abortion, things like slavery, or sex trafficking, racism, those sort of things. And the problem was at that time our mindset was that this was still too big for us. These are things that were just kind of beyond what we could imagine taking care of. And so at the end of the study, it was a good book, but we probably all did what I did, at least for me. We put the book on the shelf, and it sat there collecting dust. But there was one thing I remember very clearly was that our Christian call when we receive the Spirit of God within all of us is that when we see something wrong, we should feel something moving within us to do something. When we see injustice, we should feel compelled to act and do something. But that's where I left at that point. And a few years later, when Bethany Christian Services came, they spoke to us about the need for foster families and all the children that needed care. I was sitting there in the pews, and I could hear a voice in my head saying, "That's something that could be taken care of." And so I thought about it, but honestly, I probably didn't get enough prayer. I didn't get enough time to really consider it, and I was just afraid of the certainty, the commitment, the time, just whatever I could do to do this. It's not something that we ever, you don't grow up learning how to do that. And so I never mentioned out loud. Alicia never heard me talk about it, but deep down we could hear a voice talking to us. And every now and then I would joke with Alicia, say, don't you think our family could be a little bit bigger? And she would tell us, we are way too old to have more kids. And she didn't know at the time, but we really wanted.
So midlife crises, they kind of manifest themselves in different people in different ways. Some people buy sports cars, some people get plastic surgery, but I became a foster mom. In all seriousness, about 3 or 4 years ago, I kind of had this feeling within me that I felt like I was supposed to be doing something else, that I was called to something more. I'd already taken on a part-time job, and while I enjoyed it, it didn't really seem to be what it was that was missing. But it did land me in a lot of community meetings with different organizations that would just talk about the opportunities in Elbert County for service, and DFACS was one of them. And they were always begging and pleading for foster homes. At one point, there were no foster homes in Elbert County, and they had like 20 kids in care, and were having to send all of them out of county. And so I probably felt pretty moved during those meetings because I found myself sitting on my hands. I'm really quick to volunteer to do things. And so I had to sit on my hands to keep myself from saying, I'll do it. But I really did try to ignore the call. But one day during a yoga class, I sat there in child's pose or something, and I had this thought that came to me that out of nowhere, that maybe we really were supposed to foster. But as you all know, fostering is not easy, and so I was not ready. I didn't want to do it, and so I pushed it aside. And then the last couple of years here at church brought a lot of vacancies and positions, and I would get asked if I would do something, and I would say, okay, sure, maybe this is what God wants me to do, and this is what is missing. But in the end, that wasn't what it was, and I just was really more busy than ever. And I don't want to seem like I was trying to figure all this out on my own, because I did frequently ask God for direction and let me in on what I was missing, but he really, really seemed silent at the time. And so in September 2020, I did a short 4-lesson devotional, new version about hearing from God. And the last lesson actually suggested that if you hadn't heard from God lately, it could be because he's already told you to do something and you ignored him. And so I found that interesting. And that night I began to think and to reflect, and the next morning I talked to God very, very honestly and asked him to show me how, if I had been disobedient, if there was something that he wanted me to do that I had said no to. And it was a very, very audible voice that spoke to me and reminded me that we were supposed to foster. And so that morning, I cried all morning. I walked around like a zombie all afternoon. And then when Jonathan finally came home that evening, we sat down. And I broke the news to him, because this is not something we had ever once discussed, not in any seriousness anyway. And I really had no idea what he was going to say or how I was going to react. And so, but when we did sit down and I told him what I've just told you, he looked at me and he said, yeah, I've been waiting on you. And so that night we prayed and we contacted Bethany the next day and began what would be about a 9-month journey to get certified by the state. In the meantime, obviously, we talked to our kids about it. This was quite a shock for them. Audrey had always been kind of really pushing us to, ever since Bethany had come, but the others, it was a shock, but they were really supportive from the very beginning, and I think they had an understanding that it was God's call for our entire family and not just for us. And so there were a mountain of documents that had to be submitted. We had to do all kinds of interviews, and had our whole life story printed and submitted to the state, basically. And then, we had gates to put up and locks to install and drawers, and really had to get our water tested and treated 3 times to get it approved. It was a crazy long process. It seemed like it was going to never end, but kind of like pregnancy, about 9 months. And then the real hard work began. We got our feet wet last summer. Some of you may remember we had a couple of placement, a brother and sister placement for a respite care for 1 week, and they came to us clean and fairly well behaved and acted like normal kids, and we thought, we got this. This is going to be fun. We got to be kind of fun aunt and uncle, and then we got to send them on their way. And then in August, we got our 2 boys, which were a more permanent placement. Permanent meaning you don't know when they're leaving, not forever. They will leave eventually. But for now, we have them, and you've probably all seen them. And they arrived quite different than the two that we had in respite. Smelled like cigarette smoke, had a few changes of clothes and its trash bag, and there was a note from the grandmother who had been taking care of them for a couple of months since they'd been removed from their mom's home. And she just apologized for it and said, you know, it's only going to be for a little while. We began the process of getting to know them, hearing their stories, quickly learning about their adventures living with wolf rats, about periods of homelessness, how they've happened to dumpster dive for toys, things that really break your heart. But the first few days and weeks went fairly smoothly, but about 2 weeks into our placement, one of the boys got sick with an ear infection, and due to reasons we now understand, didn't at the time, he refused to take medicine. And after spending all of my energy and patience trying to convince him to take some Tylenol so he'd feel better, I lost my temper, yelled at him, just got extremely angry and left the room. And then I found myself locked in the bathroom, crying and telling God that he had made his first ever mistake, calling me to be a foster mom. I was obviously not cut out for it. I had just yelled at a sick kid who had been weeks earlier torn from his mom, who he loved, from his sisters who he had loved, and had endured horrific living situations for most of his life. What on earth kind of person was I? Those kind of experiences and questioning of our call continued regularly throughout the fall. It didn't take long for us to recognize that one of the boys had significant emotional scars and no coping skills, and we descended into a constant state of chaos in our home with unimaginable meltdowns on the normal, becoming the norm every time the word no was uttered. We had no idea what to do, where to go, or how to handle it, and where to go to get help. There were times when I was personally so drained of all love, patience, and compassion for children that desperately needed it, and I had nothing left to give of my own. We also felt very alone in the battle because until you've lived it, you can't understand it, and we didn't know anybody who had lived it. We did often question how God could have possibly called us to this. What was he going to do to my own children? Were they going to hate me for bringing this chaos into our home? And how in the world were we going to go on like this indefinitely? Because it did not seem to be an end in sight. Thankfully, God gave us his word. And in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, Jesus invites the weary and heavy laden to come to him, to give him our burdens, and to find rest for our weary souls. In Hebrews 4, he reminds us that we don't have a high priest who is not able to sympathize with our weaknesses. And he encourages us in verse 16 to draw confidently to the throne of grace so that we can receive mercy and grace and help in our time of need. So with no one else to turn to, we claim these promises as our own, and we finally quit trying to fix things by ourselves. We repented and we began begging God for help. Over and over on a daily basis, we asked for daily renewal of love, compassion, and patience, that we would become a conduit for his, since ours ran out way too quick. We asked for someone, a professional, to help the boys through their hurts, and also to help us have an understanding of what their needs were and how to best help them. And we certainly also asked for support for us. And it didn't happen overnight, but slowly we began to see God work things out for us. He sent a therapist who at the time was practicing in Athens, but was going to be moving her practice to Bowman, of all places, who was able to give us insight into what was going on in this child's brain and how we were able to take that preliminary diagnosis and read enough to understand it better and eventually find ways to help him with medication, therapy, and some non-traditional parenting techniques. We frequently listened to podcasts and read books that assured us we were not alone in our journey. Most foster care children have the same types of issues, and they have to be parented differently, certainly differently than we had ever parented our own kids. And on December 14th, he gave us eyes that saw. We had 2 case managers in our home at the time, and he had his last final major meltdown. And it was a pretty horrible afternoon, but there was some satisfaction that came in knowing that others had seen what we were dealing with and they understood us, and then they felt more compelled to help us. But that same evening, God provided approval for some medicine for him, and both were answered prayers, and that really became the turning point for the end of the chaos in our home. But we also learned that to be really successful and to keep our sanity, we were going to have to learn to ask for help from others, and neither one of us are really very good at that. And so we were so thankful that the help came in form of angels dressed as ladies from his church who were willing to spend time with them outside of church, often at their favorite restaurant, McDonald's. So in addition to witnessing God's provision, we also seen him move in the hearts of our children and the hearts of the boys. The first night they came to our home, I asked them if they'd ever heard of Jesus. And they made some mention of demons and angels, but the obvious answer was no. Now, often they fight over who's going to say the blessing before dinner, and they always give thanks for the people in their lives, sometimes naming them one by one, and some of you are included in that list. They will be quick to tell you how glad they are to finally know who created the world and that he loves them. Our own children have been amazing partners in this journey. We've seen God use them to show his love and compassion toward the boys every time they read a story or felt a bedtime. They build a Lego set with them, or they fix them just a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so when we step back and we look at the journey, we see how God's hand had just so happened to be moving in our lives times when we recognize it, we could see it, but there are other times that we didn't. And from this, we can see fruits being born in us and our kids, like patience and kindness and even self-control. Throughout this process, we've also had to come to terms with the fact that we have absolutely no control of anything in the foster process. Literally everything is out of control, how a child behaves when they come into your care, the government intrusion into your own personal space, how long you will wait for answers or documents from a caseworker so that you can go to a doctor or dentist that they have mandated, and certainly how long they'll be with us and when they'll leave our home. This lack of control about their past and our present and their future is what makes you realize that you have to put your faith in God and be willing to trust him with the process. He asks us to take that first blind step into the faith, into the unknown, and to continue that walk when nothing makes sense, when nothing is working, and when nothing seems to be going according to plan. But in all this, the past 9 months have been the most faith-affirming of my life, as I've seen and felt God's provision over and over and over again.
So as I think about America and living here, it's very common for us to say here in church and out there how blessed we are. And I just think about, you see it on posters, you see it in prayers, you see it on social media, hashtag, you see it on Etsy craft things you can hang on your wall. And we realized through this that, how do we really get to experience God's blessings? And, what it was for us was just letting go of the things we thought we were blessed with and getting to share it with these boys. Getting to share it in a way that they could see that God loved them, And so we exchanged a bunch of kind of gouged out furniture, some paint on the walls, some marks and things that, really doesn't matter. And exchange it for true blessings and blessings of seeing one of the boys who came, had to repeat kindergarten, who is now one of the top readers in his class. And we get to hear these boys pray at night to God and Jesus, and asking and begging to read one more Bible story at the very end because they want to keep reading. And most recently this week, when they came home from school, when they brought home the school crafts and all these things that were made for Mom. And they were made for Alicia, and they were made, with her name, as far as all the things that you can list why you love your mom, and that's it. And so I think we come to see that, this is something that foster care is placed in our lives as a way to fulfill that Great Commission, that big thing that we thought was too big to do, that Jesus said, this was one of those ways. And then also, it's a way for us to see what Jesus really meant. You know, in Luke 9, when he says to take up our cross daily and follow him, this is our way to see that happen for us. Because every day, you know, we get a chance to see kids who are, you know, battered and bruised emotionally and spiritually. We get to, you know, show them love and compassion. We have a chance to help them heal. We have a chance to show them that they are treasured and loved. And even when they're acting out in rage and when they're just, you know, so upset and you just can't explain, we have a chance to do that. And I think that's an opportunity for every member of this church to experience that. That's not something that is meant to be kept up. It's something that we can share for everybody. And so in James 1:27, he writes that, you know, religion that is pure, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and undefiled, is this: to look after orphans and widows in their time of need. And right now in the U.S., there's about 400,000 every year that are modern-day orphans needing foster care. About 100,000 of those will be able to kind of be placed with their families, but there's over 300,000 that will have to be placed in other homes and families that they're unrelated to. And so those 300,000 children are just opportunities for the church to step in. And if that's too big of a number, I think just right here in Georgia, we look at about 8,000 kids who are in foster care. In Elbert County, there's about 16 kids who are in foster care, but none of them are actually staying in Elbert County. They've been moved elsewhere. And the reason is there's only 4 homes in Elbert County. There's only 4, and Georgia has about 4,000 for these kids. But the good news is that, you know, in Elbert County, there's almost 80 churches for these kids. And Georgia has over 12,000 churches. So we see this as an awesome foundation to start, that the church can be the answer to these modern-day orphans when they're, you know, praying at night looking for somewhere to go. And we learned that, you know, through this journey, that it's not enough for just one person in the church, one family to be involved, because it's so hard. And that Satan, as we know, is just waiting to tear us down individually. He's prowling like a lion, and he's waiting to devour us. And we need those strength in numbers to take care of these kids. And so we're not trying to, you know, up here, we never want to suggest or guilt trip that everybody should do foster care, because it's not for everybody. But there's something that all of us can do. And we've learned that we're not a super family, that, you know, we have moments where we're going to sit around in the circle and just stare at each other and grumble and complain. And I've been through on lip a couple of times, just kind of wondering, you know, how can I put up with this? But, you know, God's okay with that. And we couldn't keep doing what we did without the people here in this church who helped us do that. And I think without that, we look at the numbers of the people who don't have the church, that over almost 50% of them will quit in that first year. And that means that these kids will be moving from home to home to home every single time. And so we asked that, you know, what if everybody in the church had that, you know, just idea, that commitment to try and love these children, try to support them, and try to keep them from doing the same cycle. You know, that passion that we have for VBS every summer, that one week when we pour everything we can into those kids and pray that they come back the next summer. We pray that it's something that, you know, we can do this every day. And so there are a lot of ways that people can serve, and there's you know, so many things that we can list that don't require being a full-time, you know, foster parent or foster family. And that's okay, because the people out there need them. And just in closing, if you haven't watched the news lately, there's been a big thing about Roe v. Wade, and just how much the abortion talk has come back into our lives. And I think we should be proud as Christians to celebrate that, you know, we are pro-choice, or pro-choice, pro-life. That we love every life, that every life matters to God. But, you know, we have to remember that, you know, sometimes in these lives that there are going to be troubled mothers and families, fathers who maybe made that difficult choice to not abort, to have a birth child. But maybe even despite their best intentions, you know, they meant well, but they couldn't follow through with those promises, and they're trapped. And those kids are you know, stuck in that cycle, and they're desperate and need someone to help them. And so, you know, for us, you know, as a church, you know, do we really trust that these agencies, DFACs, who are so understaffed and underpaid, and they have so many kids to look after, can they really produce godly results without us as a church being there to help them? How can we expect that? And so, as we talk about being pro-life, can we talk about being there through the entire process? You know, the child's life, all the way from beginning to the end. Can we step in and remember that, Jesus told us that he's here for the little children. Matthew 19:14, when he says, let the little children, come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And so we can't touch all 400,000 in America. I know that's too big. 8,000 even in Georgia is a lot, but for Deep Creek and every church here in this county, I hope and pray that we can start there, that we can start to resolve to help them in some way. And only God knows what that's going to look like for all of us in here in this room. But I do know it begins by starting, by being willing to listen to God, and being willing to take that first step of faith. And then, as Alicia shared, if you're wondering if he's already spoken to us, is he going to say something? Maybe he already has. And maybe he's just waiting for us to listen.
Thanks for listening. Thank you, Cleve, for giving us an opportunity to share.